Maria Williams walked into the courtroom with a steady step, her heels clicking sharply against the cold marble floor. The day ahead promised to be like any other, but Maria could feel a subtle shift in the air, like something was off. She had dealt with courts and judges countless times before, but today it felt different, as if the weight of the room was heavier than usual. She was a skilled paralegal known for her meticulous attention to detail and years of experience in handling complex cases, often unseen yet vital behind the scenes in the world of law. She had worked tirelessly on numerous cases and had a reputation for being precise and organized, yet it never seemed to be enough for some of the court staff, who still looked at her as though she were new or unqualified, no matter how much success she had already proven herself with. Maria's case today was simple enough. It was a minor administrative error, one that shouldn't have even made it to court, but somewhere along the way a mistake had been made, and now it was up to the judge to make a ruling. She had done her part. She had reviewed the files countless times and had made sure every detail was in order. Still, mistakes were inevitable, and sometimes they couldn't be avoided, but she knew she had done her job right. She sat in the back of the courtroom, flipping through the papers one last time as the judge entered the room, his presence immediately commanding silence. The usual murmur of voices ceased as he walked to his bench, his dark suit and stern expression exuding authority. He was Judge John Andrews, a man who had seen it all and whose reputation for swift and unyielding decisions preceded him by far. He had been known to be strict and to the point, rarely entertaining any delays or unnecessary explanations from anyone in his courtroom. Maria's nerves were steady, but she knew this was not a man that took kindly to what he likely saw as mistakes in his court. The clerk called her name, and Maria stood up with a deep breath, walking toward the front of the courtroom as the judge looked up at her for a brief moment, their eyes meeting for just a second before he turned back to his papers without giving her a second glance. She presented the case calmly, explaining the mistake that had been made. She showed the judge the paperwork, the supporting documents, everything that proved the error had not been hers. It was a simple clerical issue, one that could easily be fixed, but the judge didn't seem interested in her explanation. His gaze remained fixed on the documents in front of him, and within moments he made his decision. Maria was stunned as Judge Andrews glanced up from his papers and announced that she was to be fined for the mistake. He did not ask for more information. He didn't seem to care that her explanation was reasonable and that the error had not been intentional. In fact, he barely even looked at her. He simply issued the fine and moved on to the next case as though nothing had happened. She stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing with confusion and frustration. The words felt like a punch in the stomach, and yet she forced herself to nod respectfully and walk back to her seat, her thoughts already racing. What had just happened? What had she missed? Why was she being treated this way for something that wasn't even her fault? And just as quickly as the thought came, it hit her. She realized something deeper. It wasn't just the mistake that was bothering her. It was the way she had been dismissed in front of everyone. Something in the way the judge had looked at her told her that she was being judged for more than just the paper she had presented today. Maria left the courtroom with a lingering sense of disbelief that gnawed at her insides. Her steps were slower now, and her mind was racing. It was almost as if the fine wasn't the issue at all. It was the way it had been handed down, as though she were insignificant, as though the judge had made his decision before she even spoke. She had grown accustomed to being underestimated, but this was different. This felt personal, somehow as if her worth had been dismissed in front of everyone, and she wasn't sure how to process it. She made her way back to her office, trying to shake off the anger that was building up inside her. There was something unsettling about how easily the judge had issued the fine without any consideration of her side of the story. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that something didn't add up. She had been careful in reviewing the documents. She had ensured that everything was in order, yet somehow a mistake had been made, and she was being penalized for it. As she sat at her desk, the office around her buzzing with the sound of phone calls and paperwork shuffling, she pulled up the case files on her computer, once again determined to figure out where things had gone wrong. Maybe there was something she missed, something she hadn't noticed. Before she scrolled through the documents, slowly, carefully rereading every page, hoping to find some clue that would explain the error. It wasn't long before she found it, a small but significant detail, hidden in plain sight, something that pointed directly to an oversight. made by the court staff rather than anything on her end. She stared at the screen in disbelief. It was as though a light bulb had gone off in her head, and for the first time since the fine was issued, she felt a flicker of hope she wasn't to blame after all the error had occurred on their end, not hers. Maria's fingers hovered over the keyboard as she considered her next steps. She knew that simply pointing out the mistake wasn't enough. It wasn't about the fine anymore. It was about the principle of it. She couldn't just let the judge's hasty decision slide, especially when it was based on a clerical mistake. She had worked too hard for too long to be dismissed so easily. But then another thought crossed her mind, one that made her pause. She had been managing this judge's case for the past few weeks, working on the complex legal matters that involved him without him even knowing it. She had been handling his legal affairs and overseeing his paperwork, every detail meticulously arranged and carefully reviewed by her, and yet he had no idea that she was the one behind it all. It was a strange thought, a twist that Maria hadn't expected, and yet, as she thought about it more, she realized how ironic it was. The judge who had just fined her for a mistake was the same man who had unknowingly relied on her expertise for his own legal issues. All along, she had been the one managing his case, guiding it through the intricate steps of the legal system, and now he had dismissed her as just another administrative error. Maria leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen, lost in thought. The discovery left her unsettled yet empowered at the same time. It was one thing for him to ignore her as a professional. It was another for him to be unaware of how deeply her work impacted his own case. She felt a rush of determination flood her veins. This wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. It was about confronting the truth. She couldn't let this injustice stand. She wasn't just Maria Williams, the paralegal. She was the reason his case was moving forward, and it was time he knew that. The thought of confrontation scared her, but Maria knew what had to be done. She would have to address the situation head-on and make sure the judge understood exactly who she was and how much his hasty decision had cost her, not just professionally, but personally too. She wasn't going to let anyone define her worth for her, not even a judge. Maria sat at her desk, the realization sinking in like a heavy stone in her chest. She had been managing Judge Andrews' case for weeks, overseeing the most sensitive aspects of his legal matters, and all along he had no idea who she was. The irony was almost too much to bear. This was the same judge who had just fined her for a simple clerical mistake, who had barely given her the time of day. And now she discovered he had unknowingly relied on her to navigate through his own complicated legal issues. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she processed the situation. Maria had always known that the legal world had its own set of power dynamics, but this was something else entirely. The man who had just dismissed her as insignificant was unknowingly dependent on her expertise. He didn't realize that she was the one keeping his case afloat, meticulously reviewing every document, ensuring deadlines were met, and preparing his case for trial. He had no idea that the case he had entrusted to his legal team was ultimately under her care. For a moment, Maria felt a surge of empowerment. She wasn't just a faceless paralegal. She was the invisible force making sure things went smoothly behind the scenes. She had been doing the work that no one else wanted to do, quietly ensuring that things didn't fall apart. But now she had a choice to make: confront the judge and risk her career, or let it go and quietly bear the burden of his ignorance. The more she thought about it, the more the decision became clear. This wasn't just about a fine or a mistake anymore. It was about standing up for herself and demanding respect. She had worked too hard to be dismissed like this, and it wasn't just for her sake. It was for everyone like her who had been overlooked or undervalued in the legal system. Maria wasn't going to let this moment slip by. She needed to make him understand who she was and what she brought to the table. But first, Maria needed to gather her evidence. She spent the next few hours carefully compiling the documentation that would prove her point. Emails, case files, legal briefs, all of it showing her critical role in managing Judge Andrews' case. As she went through the documents, her determination grew stronger. She wasn't just going to correct a mistake. She was going to force the system to recognize the invisible work that often went unappreciated. Once everything was in order, Maria made her way to the courthouse's administrative offices. She needed to meet with the court staff and discuss the fine. The thought of confronting the judge directly was still daunting, but she knew that she needed to bring this issue to light before she could think about how to deal with him. Maria had spent years navigating the labyrinth of the legal system, but today felt different. Today, she wasn't just following the rules, she was about to make them notice her. As she entered the office, the air was thick with the hum of activity. Attorneys, clerks, and staff shuffled around, going through their own cases, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Maria's presence was met with polite but detached nods. No one knew the weight she was carrying, but that would change soon. She cleared her throat and approached the front desk, where a familiar clerk looked up at her with a neutral expression. "I need to speak to someone about the fine issued to me in Judge Andrews' courtroom," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. The clerk blinked in surprise but quickly directed her to the office of the head administrator. As Maria walked toward the administrator's office, she felt a sense of purpose settle over her. She wasn't just going to be a passive participant in this system anymore. She was going to make them see her, and in doing so, perhaps she would change the way the system saw others like her too. This wasn't just about clearing her name, it was about taking back control. It was time for the judge and the entire court to understand just how much power she really held. Maria sat at her desk, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her chest. The more she thought about the fine, the more she realized it wasn't just about the mistake. It was about the way she had been dismissed, overlooked, and undervalued by someone who didn't even know the full scope of her work. She was a paralegal, yes, but her role was far more than that. She was the backbone of the legal system, the one who kept everything running smoothly. And yet today, a man who had unknowingly relied on her expertise had reduced her to a mere administrative error. She knew this moment couldn't go unaddressed. It wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about standing up for everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or treated as invisible in a system that valued only certain types of authority. Maria's pulse quickened as she thought about how to handle this. Confronting the judge directly was not a decision she could take lightly. But one thing was clear, she wouldn't let this go. She couldn't. As the day stretched on, Maria began to formulate a plan. First, she would need to gather every shred of evidence to support her claim. She couldn't just rely on her word. She needed to show that the fine was not only unfair, but based on a clerical mistake made by the court itself. There had to be something more than just her word to convince the powers that be that she wasn't just some paralegal trying to make waves. She spent the rest of the afternoon combing through the case files, carefully reviewing each document. There it was, an error in the court's own records, a discrepancy that had slipped through the cracks, one that Maria was certain would be enough to show the mistake wasn't hers. With her findings in hand, she felt a sense of resolve take hold of her. She wasn't just clearing her name anymore. She was about to challenge an entire system that had failed her, and countless others, time and time again. The next step was the most daunting. Maria had to speak with the court's administrative staff. It was one thing to have the evidence. It was another thing entirely to present it in a way that wouldn't make her seem like a troublemaker. The last thing she wanted was to be labeled as someone who was trying to stir up trouble. But Maria knew she couldn't stay quiet. She had spent too many years as the unsung worker in the background, making sure everything ran smoothly, only to be told her mistake was the reason things had gone wrong. No, she wouldn't accept that. She crafted her approach carefully, practicing in front of the mirror as she rehearsed the words she'd say to the administrator. She needed to remain calm, collected, and most importantly, professional. She would present the evidence, explain how the error had occurred, and make it clear that she wasn't just a passive participant in the legal system. She was an integral part of it. It was time for the court to see her as more than just a faceless worker. It was time for them to see Maria Williams for who she truly was, a force to be reckoned with. As Maria prepared herself for the meeting, she thought about the risks. She could be seen as overstepping, as someone who was challenging the authority of the judge. But she knew she couldn't let that fear stop her. If she backed down now, she would be giving up everything she had worked for. She had spent years earning the respect of her colleagues and proving herself in a field that didn't always value her contributions. She wasn't going to let one man's blind judgment erase all of that. With everything in place, Maria took a deep breath and picked up the phone to schedule the meeting. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. It was time to take the next step in reclaiming her power. The judge may have dismissed her once, but Maria was determined to make sure he and everyone else would never make that mistake again. Maria walked through the courthouse corridors with a quiet determination, her steps echoing as they led her to the administrator's office. The weight of what she was about to do was palpable, but she didn't waver. The conversation she had planned was not going to be easy. She knew that, but it was necessary. The thought of confronting the court about the fine, the misjudgment, and the oversight filled her with a mix of anxiety and resolve. She couldn't let the system get away with this. Not when she knew she had been right all along. When she reached the office, the administrator, a woman named Susan Thompson, greeted her with a polite but neutral smile. Maria could tell from the look in Susan's eyes that she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. People at this level of the courthouse were used to complaints, but they were rarely from someone like Maria, a paralegal who had quietly worked behind the scenes, staying out of the spotlight until now. Maria forced a smile as she shook Susan's hand, trying to steady the pounding of her heart. "I need to discuss the fine issued by Judge Andrews," Maria began, her voice calm but firm. "It was based on a mistake that was not mine." Susan raised an eyebrow but gestured for Maria to sit. "Of course. Go on," she said, her tone still neutral. She had heard similar complaints before, but there was something different in Maria's demeanor today. She wasn't just here to apologize for an error. She was here to correct a wrong, and Maria could see that Susan was beginning to understand that. Maria took a deep breath before speaking again. She didn't want to sound defensive, but she couldn't let her frustration cloud her words. "The error was not on my part. It was a clerical mistake made by the court staff. I've reviewed all of the documents, and I can prove it." She pulled out the paperwork, neatly arranged and ready for presentation. Each document was a piece of evidence in her defense, showing how the mistake had occurred not because of anything she had done, but because of an administrative oversight. Susan leaned forward, her eyes scanning the papers. Maria could feel the tension in the room rise as the administrator looked over the evidence. There was no denying the mistake, but Maria knew that Susan's reaction would depend on how much weight she gave the situation. Would she dismiss it, like everyone else? Or would she recognize that Maria had been right all along? "You're saying this was a mistake made by the court staff?" Susan asked, glancing up at Maria. Maria nodded, her hand steady. "Yes, I've gone through the records multiple times. The fine was issued without any investigation into the circumstances surrounding it, and I've been managing Judge Andrews' case, the one he's handling right now. I've been overseeing it, making sure everything is in order, and he didn't even know it." Susan's eyes widened slightly. The room was quiet, the weight of Maria's words hanging in the air. Maria could see that the administrator was now beginning to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. Not only was Maria defending herself against a wrongful fine, but she was revealing something bigger. Judge Andrews had unknowingly relied on her expertise for the very case he was presiding over. The power dynamic had shifted. Maria wasn't just another person working under the judge. She was the person who had been quietly running the case, ensuring that everything went according to plan. The administrator sat back in her chair, processing the information. Maria's heart pounded in her chest as the silence stretched between them. She had made her case, but now it was out of her hands. Would they take her seriously? Would they see this for what it truly was, an injustice that needed to be corrected? Finally, Susan spoke. "I see. This is much more serious than I thought. I'll need to look into this and speak with Judge Andrews." Maria didn't flinch. "Please do. But just know that this isn't just about me. It's about how the system treats those who aren't always in the spotlight. We can't keep letting mistakes like this go unnoticed. I'm not here to make trouble. I'm just here to make sure the right thing is done." Susan nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I'll make sure we get to the bottom of this. Thank you for bringing it to my attention, Maria." Maria stood up, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. She had spoken her truth, and for the first time, it felt like someone was truly listening. As she left the office, she couldn't help but feel that a small but significant shift had occurred. She wasn't just the person behind the scenes anymore. She was visible. And now the court would have to reckon with the fact that Maria Williams was more than just a paralegal. She was a force to be reckoned with. Maria walked out of the administrator's office, feeling a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The confrontation had been difficult, but necessary. She had made her case, and now it was out of her hands. There was nothing more she could do for the moment except wait and see how the system would respond. The thought of the fine still stung, but the feeling of having spoken up, of having forced the court to reckon with her role, kept her from feeling entirely defeated. As she made her way back to her office, Maria couldn't shake the thoughts swirling in her head. She had spent years working tirelessly behind the scenes, never seeking credit, never asking for recognition. But now, in a single conversation, she had made herself known. The question was, what would happen next? Would the court actually do something about the fine? Or would they sweep it under the rug, as they had with so many other mistakes? Later that afternoon, as Maria was reviewing another case file, her phone buzzed. It was an email from Susan Thompson, the administrator. Maria's heart skipped a beat as she opened it. The message was brief, but to the point. I've spoken to Judge Andrews. The fine has been lifted. I also want to schedule a meeting with you to discuss your role in his case. Please let me know when you're available. Maria read the email twice, trying to process what it meant. The fine had been lifted. That was good, but the second part of the message, the part about discussing her role in the judge's case, was even more intriguing. It was clear now that Susan understood the full scope of Maria's involvement. The question was, what would this meeting be about? Would they finally recognize her work, or would it be another opportunity to quietly dismiss her? Maria quickly replied, confirming a time to meet. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew this could be the moment that determined her future in the legal world. Would she continue to be the person behind the scenes, or would this be her chance to step into the light? The next morning, Maria arrived at the courthouse early. She had spent the night thinking about the meeting, running through different scenarios in her mind. She knew the stakes were high. If they recognized her contributions, it could change everything, open up new opportunities, give her the respect she had always deserved. But if they brushed her off, if this meeting was nothing more than a formality, she wasn't sure how she would handle it. When she walked into Susan's office, she was surprised to see Judge Andrews sitting there. He was leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Maria's stomach tightened. This was the moment. She had no idea what to expect, but she wasn't about to back down now. The judge looked up as she entered, his gaze briefly flicking over her before returning to Susan. Maria, Susan said, gesturing to the chair across from them. Please have a seat. We need to discuss your role in Judge Andrews' case. Maria nodded, taking a seat with a calmness she didn't entirely feel. She could feel the tension in the room, the unspoken history between her and the judge. He still hadn't said anything, and Maria had no idea whether he felt embarrassed, defensive, or something else entirely. Finally, Judge Andrews spoke. I understand there's been some confusion regarding your role in my case. I wasn't aware of the extent of your involvement until Susan brought it to my attention. Maria nodded, keeping her tone steady. I've been managing your case for the past few weeks, ensuring everything was in order. I've reviewed every document, made sure deadlines were met, and provided the necessary legal support. The judge looked at her for a moment, his face unreadable. For a moment, Maria thought he might dismiss her again, as he had done in court, but instead, he seemed to hesitate before speaking again. I wasn't aware of how integral your work had been, he admitted, his voice quieter than she had expected. I've always relied on my legal team, but it seemed to have overlooked someone very important. Maria didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to hear an apology, to hear him admit that he had been wrong, but she knew better than to expect that. Instead, she nodded. I understand. I've always done my job to the best of my ability. I'm just here to make sure things get done. Susan, who had been silent until now, spoke up. Maria, I think it's time we recognize your contributions. You're not just a paralegal. You're a vital part of this process, and it's time the court acknowledges that. Maria's heart raced. This wasn't just about fixing a mistake anymore. This was about her future, about how the court would see her from now on. She had no idea where this conversation would lead, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally being seen for who she truly was. The words hung in the air, heavy and charged. Maria's heart raced, but she remained poised, her hand steady on her lap. This wasn't just another moment of being acknowledged for her work. It was a turning point, a moment that could change everything. Judge Andrews looked between Susan and Maria, his brow furrowed as though he was processing something significant. The silence stretched, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like the calm before the storm, the final moment before everything shifted. "Maria," the judge finally said, his voice softer than it had been in court. "I have to admit, I didn't realize the full extent of your role until now. I didn't know how much I was relying on you." Maria nodded, her expression neutral. She had expected something like this, but hearing him say it out loud was a different experience. He wasn't apologizing, but he was acknowledging what she had always known. Her work was the foundation that held many things together. He was no longer blind to it, and that was something she could hold on to. Susan, sensing the importance of the moment, spoke up. "Maria, I believe it's time we start treating your role with the respect it deserves. You've been working under the radar for too long, and it's time to make sure the court recognizes your expertise and the significant contributions you make every day." Maria's breath caught. It was as though a weight had been lifted, but she didn't dare let herself relax just yet. She had fought for this moment, for the recognition that was long overdue, but this was only the beginning. She knew she had to be careful. One misstep, one moment of weakness could send her back to the shadows where she had spent too many years. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her voice steady but her mind racing. She had to know if this was truly going to lead to something tangible, something that would ensure her place in the courtroom, not just as a faceless worker, but as someone whose work was central to the legal process. Susan exchanged a look with Judge Andrews before answering. "We're considering giving you more responsibilities, Maria. Not just overseeing the documents, not just managing cases. We want to elevate your role. We want you to be a part of the larger legal process, not just in the background, but in the front." Maria blinked, trying to process the words. Elevating her role. It sounded almost too good to be true. For so long, she had been buried under layers of paperwork, invisible to the very people who should have known her worth. But now the court, Judge Andrews no less, was offering her something more. Something that could change the trajectory of her entire career. "You're offering me a more prominent position?" she asked, her voice betraying a hint of disbelief. She had never expected anything like this. Not from the court, and certainly not from the man who had fined her just days earlier. Judge Andrews nodded. "Yes, we've been discussing it, and we believe that with your knowledge and skills, you could be an invaluable asset in a more leadership-oriented role. This is an opportunity for you to step out of the shadows, to be seen for the vital work you're already doing." Maria's mind raced. She had always believed in her abilities, but to hear it from them, to hear it from the very judge who had brushed her off before, felt surreal. She couldn't deny the feeling of pride that swelled in her chest, but there was a part of her, small but persistent, that worried this was just another empty promise. She had seen too many people, especially women and people of color in her position, given promises of change that never materialized. "I appreciate the offer," Maria said carefully, "but I need to know this isn't just lip service. I need to see the steps being taken, to know that my role will be more than just a title." Susan smiled. "You have my word, Maria. This is real. We're committed to making sure your work is not just recognized, but valued at every level." The words felt different this time, more genuine, more grounded. Maria allowed herself a breath of relief. She wasn't just fighting for validation anymore. She was fighting for change, for her future, and for others who had been dismissed, overlooked, or forgotten in the legal system. She wasn't going to let this chance slip away. Judge Andrews leaned forward, his gaze meeting hers with newfound respect. "I've been wrong about a lot of things, Maria, but I'm not wrong about this. Your work matters." Maria nodded, her heart swelling with a quiet pride. The court had finally seen her. They had finally recognized her contributions. And now she had a seat at the table, a seat she would never relinquish. This was only the beginning. Maria stood outside the courthouse, the warm sunlight spilling over her as she took a deep breath. The events of the past week had been nothing short of transformative. What had started as a single injustice, a fine based on a mistake, had snowballed into something much bigger. She had challenged the system, and in doing so, she had reshaped her own future. As she thought back on her journey, she couldn't help but marvel at the series of events that had led her here. The fine, the frustration, the confrontation with Judge Andrews and Susan. It had all felt like a battle at the time, but now, standing in the bright light of a new day, it felt more like a turning point. Maria had fought for herself, but she had also fought for everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or undervalued. She had seen firsthand how easy it was for the court to ignore the people working behind the scenes, the ones who made sure everything ran smoothly, the ones who kept the legal machine moving forward. For years, she had been one of those people, quietly doing her job, invisible to everyone but her colleagues. But now she wasn't just a part of the system. She was beginning to shape it, and she wasn't the only one. Her phone buzzed, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Susan. The new role has been confirmed. You'll be officially transitioning into the new position starting next week. It's going to be a big change, but I know you're ready for it. We'll discuss the details on Monday. Maria couldn't suppress a smile. The new role, the recognition, it was everything she had worked for, but it was also a reminder of how much more there was to do. She wasn't just stepping into a higher position. She was setting an example. She was proving that people like her could and should be at the forefront of change. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without ensuring it meant something for others too. She thought about the other women and people of color who worked in the legal system, often relegated to behind-the-scenes roles, never acknowledged for their contributions. She had been one of them, but now she would fight to ensure that others didn't have to wait as long as she had for the recognition they deserved. She was already thinking of ways she could help create opportunities, amplify voices, and mentor those who came after her. As she made her way home, she found herself reflecting on the larger implications of her journey. It wasn't just about her career. It was about the systemic issues that needed to change. The inequality, the subtle but pervasive biases, the way people like her, Black women, people of color, had to work twice as hard, often with no recognition, in order to be seen at all. But things were changing, slowly but surely, and Maria was at the heart of that change. She had learned the hard way that fighting for what you deserve wasn't easy, but it was always worth it. When she arrived home, she sat down at her desk and looked over the case files she had been working on before the whole ordeal began. She smiled. It felt like a lifetime ago. She was no longer just a paralegal, quietly making things run smoothly. She was now someone who had the ear of those who could make a real difference. She wasn't afraid of what the future held because she knew she was ready. She picked up her phone again, this time texting her best friend. It's official. The new role starts Monday. This is just the beginning. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, looking out the window. She was proud of how far she'd come, but she also knew that this was only the first step. She had spent too long in the shadows. Now it was time for Maria Williams to lead, not just for herself, but for everyone who would follow. The change was only beginning, and Maria was determined to see it through.